he says, oh my God. We reckon we're starting. We're not quite sure of the latter of this event, so it's all a bit free and easy, but Iain likes it free and easy, so that's fine. I'm going to did you want a face? You've got a very plastic face. Didn't you like Philip? Anyway, we are the same age. In fact, I'm slightly older than you. You're July, I'm January. Which was going to be my first question. You're 60 now. So what does the future hold for Iain Dale?
Death.
Well, that's and taxation.
When I was 50 men absolutely. Your mic's not working.
Get closer.
50 men absolutely nothing to me. I don't know whether you've got to say. It didn't make me feel any different from being 40. But 60 really does. Because, I mean, that's the age. When I was a kid, I thought people at 60 basically passed it. And, yeah, I've got to see the road corridors and things like that. And you do start to. You've always been. I think that you do start to wonder, well, how much time have you got left doing what you do? I mean, I've been doing my own job for obviously 12.5 years now, and you start to think, well, okay, I'm going to do that at 65 or 70, will I still be working in something? I can't imagine retiring in the conventional sense of the word. But you do start to think about, well, should I be slowing down? In my head, I don't feel any different to when I was 30. But body tells you different things, doesn't it?
Well, that was going to be my next question, because it doesn't feel as if you're slowing down at all. By reverse, you seem to have a phenomenal work ethic. I mean, you're producing books, enormous totals, very successfully. You've got your program, you've got podcasts, and you're everywhere.
That's what my partner says. Can't be known to say no. And I do say no to a lot of things, but it seems like things I say no to. But if you've got a book out, you have an obligation to understand it, so you can accept go to literary festivals and stuff. I mean, go to Wigtown in Scotland. Anyone know where Wigtown is? It's in Sutton Tip. It's probably one of the most difficult places to get to in the United Kingdom. And of course, the RMT racing really went strike on the day they supposed to be coming back.
Sorry, don't you run the RMT?
It took him 3 minutes to get it just on that. I was at an honest burger restaurant with Jackie Smith the other night, and we were sort of having a meal, and this woman and her husband came up to me, she goes, "Can I just thank you for everything you do?" Which is one of the catchphrases we use on the Full Menu podcast. So I thought it was to do that. She said, "All your work for the workers is just brilliant." And let me stop you there. And I showed her, somebody on Twitter put a graphic of me and Nick Smith together. We were both in what did I say? English. And he was on Western Time 1 week, and I was on the other. We were both looking in exactly the same direction. And even I have to admit, that could be my twin. We were born in the same year.
Yeah, but I was born in the same year. Well,
luckily, he was traveling around July, so what was my mother doing? She was only the resemblance of something. But again, I'm apparently like the Archbishop of York as well. And sound like Rex Stein.
When I was going into Parliament for the reception of coffee, I was walking across Stamford Bridge accidentally with the Archbishop of York, who does it like.
What a threesome.
And they said to me, and I said, how did they know this and also the cake? And I think I believe Lord Canterbury said to me, well, the problem is I keep emailing God said, wing. And it ends up as God saying, publicity, which is. I said, anyway, so there's another book, isn't there? I can't remember, it's Dictated next.
No, I've got Honest Day in Politics, which comes out next week, available for sale at this bookshop. And that is a book of 365 pages individuals involved, one event in political history for each page. And it was a really interesting book to do. I wrote it myself. Because I thought I was write 30% of it just off the top of my head, some different events that maybe I focused. But it wasn't like that at all, and I had to do a hell of a lot of research, and it demonstrated to me, despite being a political geek, how little I knew about those really important subjects like the relationship between Britain and Ireland, where we don't really get taught much about that in history in schools. And I kind of knew the recent history, but did I really know the background to the activity? No, I didn't. And I didn't know much about the Eastern Rising and all those events. So actually researching was really, really interesting. You come across all sorts of things that you didn't know. For example, if I asked you, when was the first non-white MP elected? I suspect many of you are thinking 1987 maybe, 1832. And it was a mixed race guy, it was actually a slave trader, bizarrely. So there's all sorts of little quirky things like this that are in the book, as well as all sorts of famous events too. So that's the next one. And then there's Kings and Queens next to the dictators theory.
There's a very good 2-volume history of Parliament that might have been.
There is.
Actually, it was.
Suicide.
Anyway, but writing books it's quite a solitary thing. You know, it's you in the room on your own, and I think you do your own research, don't you? You get somebody else to help.
I was going to do all my own research on this day, but in the end,
the timetable, the deadline is looming. I'm never going to finish this, so I did get 2 or 3 people to help with some research and do a few sort of initial drafts, but other than that, I did it all myself. I mean, the other books, like the Prime Ministers and the Presidents, they are written by other people. I sort of put the jigsaw together of commissioning people, trying to get appropriate people to write about different Prime Ministers or Presidents. Like the dictators is actually quite difficult because you have to be subjective in the ones you choose. And I know I'm going to get a lot of criticism for having missed out 1 or 2 because you can only put so many in. It's like I've got Sir Richard Evans, who I think is probably the world authority on the Third Reich. He's going to do Hitler, which I think is a real coup to get him to do that. And on some of these books, it's actually quite difficult to get some sort of balance in terms of gender. In terms of
what you mean there aren't enough? Oh, I thought you were going to say there aren't enough female dictators in the world.
Well, actually, there's only 1 female dictator in the book, which is a good thing in some ways if you think about it. And in terms of getting the authors to write about these people, for Prime Ministers, I think out of 55, there are only 11 female contributors. And that's because there are very few female political historians out there. Kings and Queens is very different. I discovered a whole plethora of really young female academics who specialise in individual monarchs. So that is 50-50. But as I say, it's like putting together a jigsaw.
I keep a diary, and so I know what you mean about the whole not knowing the order that things come in quite often. When the whole phone hacking thing was going on, it was really useful to me that I could go back and go, that was actually on the Wednesday, that was on the Thursday, that was on the Friday, and be detailed. Do you worry that today's politics will not have enough primary sources for people to be able to go back to?
Yes, because nobody writes letters anymore. There's no, we also have emails, but there's no documents for people to go back to. So when, for example, you've got, a politician like Sir John Long, former Defence Secretary during the Falklands War, significant figure. Now he can deposit all of his papers at the University of Cambridge, Churchill College or somewhere else, I don't know. But today's politicians, they won't have that archive necessarily, because if you change a computer, you have to then keep your email archive, and so it's disappeared forever. So I think that is going to be a real problem for future historians. But why do you keep a diary? What's the motivation for that?
My pension.
Well,
do you know any publishers? No, though my agent says there's no way anybody will buy it because there's just too much of it, and it's really difficult editing diaries because there's just so much normally.
Well, tell your agent you're talking bollocks. Because, it depends what type of diary it is. If it is a bare-all type diary, then there will always be interest in it. and it doesn't matter if it's 3 million words long, you just need a good editor, or you would be the worst editor for your own diaries. And this may amuse you all, but I am about to be the editor for the Norman Fowler diaries. Now, Norman Fowler's memoir, shall we say, didn't trouble the pastures too much. But he was a journalist before he went into Parliament, and he can write. And he's a really good observer of events. I thought I knew pretty much everything about the fall of Margaret Thatcher, but he's got some really interesting new perspectives on that from these diaries. So he's actually reduced them down to about 400,000 words. So I've now got to reduce them down to about 150,000. Because, I mean, even Norman would admit, nobody wants to read 1,000 pages of Norman Fowler's diaries. I mean, those of you who may have read the Chips Channing diaries, Simon Heffer's edited those down to 3 volumes of 1,000 pages each, which even I'm struggling with. They are interesting, but they're not that interesting. So I wouldn't give up on that at all.
To answer your question more properly, I started writing the diary almost 3 months after I was elected. Oddly, my first entry in the diary is the day after. I had decided I would never drink in Parliament when I got elected. And about 3 months in, I had a drink or 10. And I'm a Bryant, so I would be voting in the A to G column. This is how we used to do voting, it's all changed now. It was the first time I bumped into Tony Blair after the general election. I think I can confidently say that I was not sober, which may explain why he never put me in government. Anyway, but it's just funny that that's my first diary entry, is I met Tony Blair last night. I'm not sure he was very impressed.
That's a good start, though. You should have people in right from the start.
Yeah. And in fact,
with Tony Blair, I only met him a couple of times. He's got no small talk. I mean, Gordon Brown, even though he had this reputation for being very dour and monosyllabic, actually, he was rather good at small talk. Tony Blair, I found, wasn't. I remember at one of these conferences in Brighton, he was doing a tour of the commercial stands, and I was running the bookshop. And he came and did a photo with me and my partner, and I don't think a single word was exchanged. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know what to say to you. Shouldn't you know what to say to me? He didn't even ask how the bookshop was going or anything.
Cherie used to do
brilliant.
Yes, exactly. And of all the people I've known in politics, who I think was completely different from the way they were portrayed in the press, Cherie is the kind of prime example. Is there anybody else that you think the press has done a disservice for?
That's a really good question. And I think generally people do characterise politicians reasonably correctly. I mean, Theresa May, for example, she was always seen as a bit of a robot without much small talk. And that was true, but there were times when she would just let loose, and she's actually got quite a filthy sense of humour. And
I'm worried now.
You see, I've got an anecdote. But
Go on.
But I'm always told I can't tell it.
Well, you can't tease us like this, can you?
All right. When she was Prime Minister, and I think it was in the early days, and she was about to go onto the Savory Ridge programme, and she'd been to church, and I'm not going to name the person, her advisor went to collect her from the church, and the Prime Minister in the limo, and they were going to the Sky Studios, and Donald Trump, this must have been October 2017, Donald Trump had it all come about his grabbing the pussy comment. And so, of course, this advisor said, well, I thought she'd better mention this to Theresa May in case she was asked about it by Savory Ridge. And she thought, how do I say this to the Prime Minister, who's notoriously a bit prim and proper? So so I've half given it away now. So she related this. And so Theresa May thought about this for a second, and then just looked at her and said, well, this is going to be a special relationship. And I've always said to her, if you had actually made that, if you had briefed the press about that comment, that would have transformed people's views of Theresa May. But anyway, none of you will relate that to any diary columns, you will believe, please.
Everybody's forgotten it already, hasn't they? Talking of Prime Ministers, you wanted David Davis to be Prime Minister, didn't you? You were his chief of staff in the leadership contest. Would he have been better than any of the ones we've had recently?
Well, he would certainly have been better than 3 of them. I mean, he's actually somebody who has always been very press friendly, but the press have always been quite willing to repeat sort of bad things about him. The fact that he's supposedly lazy. Well, I've never seen him as a lazy politician. He's actually really hard-working. And if you want to run a campaign in Parliament, he would be one of the top 5 MPs to get to front it, I think. Because once he gets something in his teeth, he's like a Jack Russell. He will relentlessly pursue it, even if it makes it uncomfortable for him politically.
He's also the most indiscreet member of Parliament there is.
Well, there's a few that
competitors, I know, but he is quite high up there.
He is quite high up there. I remember during that leadership campaign, we'd been to visit Esther McVeigh in the Wirral, and we were in a helicopter. And we had to get back to London that evening, so that's why there was a helicopter, provided by some very generous benefactor. I can't remember who it was.
Declared.
I had to do all the declarations, so that was one of the reasons, or parts of my job. And so we get in the helicopter, and the pilot was showing him all of the dials and sort of what you have to pull to do whatever. And so we get up to whatever height you get to. Mr. Davis, would you like to have a go? And his press officer now said, no, he would not. But of course, he does actually have a pilot's license, but for a plane, not a helicopter. So of course, he immediately grabs the joystick, and sort of the thing lurches. And we were like in the back, oh my God, we're not going to survive. Anyway, and he flew it right down to the M25. And of course, the M25, they follow the flight of the path of the Thames to get back to Battersea. And so I said, I think you should take over now. No, he'll be fine, the pilot says. I said, I'm sure this is illegal. So when we land, I said, right, you're not to tell anyone you've done this, because it would be just terrible. He immediately gets a call from Nick Robinson, who's political editor of the BBC, so they start talking about whatever. And at the end of the conversation, David says, you'll never guess what I've just done. Boys with toys. One of the reasons he didn't win was not because, I mean, everyone thinks I ran his campaign. If I had, things might have turned out differently, I think. But because I didn't have the letters MP after my name, a lot of the MPs who were running the campaign, Andrew Mitchell, Derek Conway, I was kind of treated like a second-class citizen. And I should have gripped that right from the start, and I didn't. So it meant that it was the worst 6 months of my working life. Not David's fault, it was partly my fault, but I hated it because I didn't really understand, I think, what chief of staff actually meant. And I should have gripped things much tighter than I did. David didn't want it to happen. That was the truth of the matter. David Cameron did, and you have to show hunger for these positions. And I think David thought, well, I think I'd be good at the job, so therefore I want to run. You've got to have that hunger, and I think he would admit that now, that he didn't. And he wanted also to protect his wife, who was not a public figure, and had always been kept in the background. And I remember once saying to Doreen, so, would you come along to this? Oh no, I'd love to, she said. But David always sort of he didn't want her to be subjected to all that. And I'm thinking, well, if you're Prime Minister, you know that that's going to happen. So we might as well start it now.
But just go back a step there. Why does that have to happen? Why are partners part of the show?
Because they just are.
Why?
Well, it will never change. The public want to know. And they have a right to know, I think. They have a right to know who somebody is. Maybe they don't have the right to know everything. But I think most successful Prime Ministers have a partner who's very supportive, can tell them the honest truth, and the electorate generally sort of make up their minds about them. I mean, Sinead Blair had an awful time, and totally unjustly, in my view. I mean, Sarah Brown did keep more in the background, certainly Norma Major did, Philip May did, but people knew who they were up to a point, and that's probably all you need to do. But you can't keep someone hidden away, because people automatically think there's a reason for that, apart from a bad reason for that.
And you stood once, didn't you, in Norfolk?
The electorate fought back fairly massively.
You were beaten by a Liberal.
I was.
And then you were beaten for the nomination by Rory Stewart and Philip Lee. Now, what happened to them?
Well, they lived to regret that, didn't they? The Windburgers and Bracknell. And that, my problem was that I'd had this really bad result in 2005 where I turned the Democrat majority of 483 in Norfolk into one of 10,600. Now, I know I didn't do that. Chris Bryant, who was the Lib Dem head of campaigns at the time, he warned me not to go for that seat. He said, Norman will get a 10,000 majority. It doesn't matter who was the candidate there, he would get a 10,000 majority, and he was right. And I did a very, very high-profile campaign. And I was the first Tory candidate to have told the selection committee that I was gay before they selected me. And they selected me with a 2/3 majority, which I will always be proud of. But of course it meant that being the first, you become slightly notorious. So Gabby Hinsliff in The Observer wrote me up as the openly gay Conservative candidate, which I was a bit annoyed about because it was true, but she'd never written that about anybody who's straight. And she, afterwards, I took it as a task and said, okay, I promise I'm going to do it again, I shouldn't have done it. But during the Bracknell selection, I was described in the Daily Mail diary column by, I can't remember his name now, Peter Mackay, as the overtly gay Conservative candidate.
As opposed to covertly gay.
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm particularly camp. You can make your own judgments on that. But I thought that's actually quite damaging to me in the middle of the selection. So I took him to the Press Complaints Commission, who found in his favour. They said, that's a diary column. I thought, well, does that give you license to write anything you like just because it's a diary column? So that didn't help me, and I came third in that, and I often wonder if that hadn't happened. Similar thing happened to me in the first selection I ever went for Chippy Barnet in 2003. I'd never done a selection before, I didn't really know what happened, didn't expect to win it, safe Conservative seat. And at the end of the first round of interviews, the chairwoman said to me, this is helpful, is there anything embarrassing about your private life or public life that would cause us embarrassment in the association? So I said, well, it doesn't embarrass me, and I hope it doesn't embarrass you. You should know that I'm gay. You should also know I'm a West Ham supporter, which may be more of a problem in this area. And most of them laughed, so I thought that was quite a good reaction. So I walked out of the room at the end, they all applauded me, and the agent came out after me, who was also gay. There's a lot of it about in politics. As Ken Livingstone used to say, the Tory party's riddled with them. Yes. He was right, but slightly unfortunately put. And the agent said, what the bloody hell did you do that for? You've just lost a few votes by doing that. And I said, well, I was asked the question. And I missed out on getting to the final round by 2 votes.
Really?
And in those days, if it was a bloke up against 2 women in the Tory party, the man always won. So I could have been Theresa Villiers.
She's got better hair, let's put it that way. I'll do a little story as well, of similar sort of thing. You may recall Michael Martin was Speaker of the House of Commons. Harriet Harman was Leader of the House of Commons, and we were going to have a speakers' conference on getting more women involved into Parliament. And the day before the motion was tabled, David Blunkett rang up and said, well, what about adding and people with disabilities? And David Lammy, I think, rang in and said, well, why are we not talking about getting more people from ethnic minorities in? All fine. And then somebody said, well, what about the gays? So Harriet Harman...
That would be you.
No, it wasn't me. I think there are far too many gays in Parliament already. My husband thinks it's virtually a gay bar now. Anyway, so Harriet had to ring Michael Martin and say to him, you're going to chair a conference which is going to be trying to get more gay MPs. And Harriet had her phone on speakerphone in the middle of the room, and I was in there, and Aisha Hazarika and various others of Harriet's team. And Michael came on, and Harriet explained what we were going to do. And Michael said, no, they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. You've got one in your office. I've got 2 in mine. There's far too many already. I've never told that story before.
It's so discreet.
It's in my diary.
What was Harriet's reaction?
Harriet, well, we carried on. He had to have more gays. What was I going to say? So the next thing I was going to ask you about was, are you a Conservative?
glad you asked that. Well, I've always been a Conservative. I voted Conservative in every election since 1983, bar one in 1997, when I lived on the Isle of Dogs, which was a safe Labour seat, townhouse. And don't boo me, I voted for UKIP just to protest against John Major. Ever since then, I've always voted Conservative. But when you present a programme like mine on the radio, I think the last 12 and a half years has, should we say, knocked the rougher edges off my politics. And I'll explain that, in that people imagine I just do political stuff, but I do a lot of emotional phone-ins on depression, grief, and I try to get people on to tell their stories, so people who've never experienced these things can actually understand. And I much prefer doing those sorts of phone-ins to talking about all the stuff that's going on now, if I'm honest. But when you're doing a phone-in on universal credit or bedroom tax, and you get 3 middle-aged men phone in, one after the other, and they all cry, you kind of think something's gone wrong. And I could sit here now and make an intellectual, theoretical argument for bedroom tax. But when you see the effect that it has on individual people, you think that that's just not right. And I think had I not done this job for the last 12 and a half years, I would have been much more right-wing than I currently feel. And it's a matter of, I find it quite difficult because as an instinctive Tory, I spend most of my time now criticising. So you get, and look, you all know because you're at a Labour Party conference, politics is a tribal sport. When your own side comes under attack, you circle the wagons, and even if you think that they're wrong, sometimes you don't admit it in public. Well, I haven't been a member of the Tory Party now for 12 years, because when I joined LBC, I thought it's just not appropriate. I did sign a partner instead. But that's what I mean by tribal. Whereas now...
When you say you signed him up, do you mean that he chose to join the Conservative Party?
Well, he's far more right than I am. And so I just said, well, I'm not renewing my membership, so you can be a member instead, so they don't lose out. And so that's what I mean by tribalism. When I finish at LBC, whenever that is, in the current environment, I certainly would not rejoin the Conservative Party. And my vote is up for grabs now. And I feel, in a sense, I don't feel a traitor saying that, but I feel I don't want to say it, because I want to be able to support the party that I've always campaigned for.
And what's taken you to that point? I noticed on Friday, sitting in the chamber for Kwasi Kwarteng's speech, one of the interesting moments for me was when Richard Drax said, "Hurrah, finally a proper Conservative budget." And I was thinking, it doesn't feel very Conservative if you're putting £72.4 billion on the national credit card to me, but is it that kind of thing, or is it, because you were quite critical of Boris Johnson, I think you felt that he had to go, didn't you?
It is partly that sort of thing, in the sense that we seem to have forgotten what the phrase sound money means, which is a very Thatcherite phrase. And I would still instinctively say that on economic issues, I am still broadly Thatcherite. Now, times move on. Things are not the same as they were in 1980 or 1990. So you have to adapt as time goes on. But on social issues, immigration, for example, I'm letters are letters. I just let anybody, frankly. Because I can see the benefits that immigration brings to this country, and I try to explain that on my programmes to people, and try and get people to put themselves in the position as somebody who gets on a boat in Calais, rather than describe this anonymous, amorphous group of people as asylum seekers. Think of them as individuals and why they're coming here. Well, Iain, they're coming here to police the benefit system. No, they're not. About 1% come here to do that. They're coming here predominantly, well, there are two types of people who come here. One type is fleeing either a war zone or torture or some horrific circumstance. So you put yourself in their position, and then you think, well, that's a rational decision that they've made. Yes, but why do they have to come here? Why don't they stay in France? So you go through the arguments, well, when you speak the language, they may have family here, blah, blah, blah. And at some point, you can almost hear the pennies dropping among some of the listeners, not all of them, but some of them. I think he's got a point there. And the economic refugees, why are they coming here? To better their lives, better their families' lives. Well, isn't that what we all want to do, in some way? And if we, in this country, were in a Syrian-type situation, I'm sure that a lot of us would then be going over the channel the other way, probably illegally. So you have to try and get people to understand why people are doing this as individuals. And when I hear Priti Patel and various others use the kind of language that they do, particularly somebody who's non-white to do that, I see recoil against that. And just from a pure economic point of view, we know there are all sorts of sectors of our economy now that really need more immigration. And Liz Truss apparently now recognises this, so who'd have thought? So on immigration, I'm a complete wet on most social issues. I mean, I used to be very anti-abortion, but I've completely sort of changed on that, because in the end, I think on most of these issues, you have to be pragmatic. And I think you could still be anti-abortion, but just accept that the law should never revert to what it was, because we don't want backstreet abortions. You can have a debate about term limits, and I think that is a legitimate debate to have. It should not be silenced. But you can't be ideological, I think, on most social issues.
Death penalty?
I used to be in favour of that for terrorists, because I thought that is sort of one degree above everything else. You're actually attacking the state rather than individuals. But again, I've sort of gone liberal on that.
Membership cards are available for the party at the back of the hall, I think.
Well, just on that, it's going to be very interesting to hear Chris Bryant this afternoon, because I kind of want him to try and drag me in. I remember when Ed Davey was running for leader of the Lib Dems. On his way out of the studio after an interview, I said, your task is to make me feel like I can vote for your party. And I can't at the moment, mainly because of your European policies. And I had the same thing with Keir. I did an hour-long interview with Keir at the Edinburgh Fringe with Jackie Smith. And I was almost desperate for him to sort of reel me in, but he didn't.
Right.
And so I don't know whether, I mean, I suspect he won't be able to this afternoon either. But my vote is up for grabs. I'm not saying anything new, I have said this before.
And so tell me, how's Brexit going?
Do you really want to go there?
Well, yes. You supported it, so...
Well, I did support it, and I would still support it. If there was a vote today, I would still support it. And the reason is that I don't think that most people who voted for Brexit voted for it because they thought that it would improve the economic quality of their life. I certainly don't think Labour voters voted for it in that regard. Yes, there were people who voted for it because they thought it would restrict immigration. And I can remember saying during the campaign on my show several times, if you're voting Leave because you think it will reduce immigration, you are deluding yourself. Because immigration is determined by the economic need for immigrants, largely. And if the economy does do well, we will actually need more immigrants to come in. So please don't think that immigration is going to go down. And sure enough, what has happened? Immigration has either remained broadly the same or it's gone up. Where it's gone down slightly is from the EU, but there's still a net plus immigration from the EU. But people in other countries are now operating on a level playing field. And that I think, is a good thing. I think we shouldn't, just because it's an EU bloc, give people from that bloc preferential treatment. Where I have a slight problem with immigration is I don't think we should be cherry-picking all of the best nurses and doctors from countries like Indonesia or the Philippines.
We should be training more here, shouldn't we?
Well, we absolutely should. And over decades, that has not happened enough. So clearly there have been big problems in some sectors caused by Brexit. I don't bizarre from that at all. But it was inevitable. When you've been in the bloc for 40 years, it's never going to be easy to unpick it. And I think we're going to have some very interesting debates over the next few weeks, because one of the things which I don't really think has come out is that there is a bill that's about to go through Parliament, something like, I can't remember what it's called, but sort of it's designed to unpick a lot of the EU regulations. And part of it, the government has to positively say, yes, we want to keep the same holiday pay arrangements or the same holiday entitlement. We want to keep the same health and safety things. And of course, a lot of people say, well, they're not going to do that, are they? They're just going to let them lapse. So I think there's going to be a big debate over that over the next few months.
And there is a bit of a problem, isn't there, about British exports, because the number of British companies,
isn't that?
well, though the thing is that most exports have been previously an import, so something that is manufactured here and sold in Europe might well have had all its bits and pieces come into us in the first place. So I'm not sure that works. But my bigger concern is that it's something like 40% of there's been a 40% fall in the number of British businesses trading, exporting in Europe.
Well, so we're told, but on the other hand, the actual amount of exports has gone up. So I don't know how those two things really marry, because if you're saying 40% of businesses now don't trade with you, we would have expected our exports to have plummeted, but they haven't. So I don't know the answer to that.
I've got one final question, because we're sort of halfway through. My final question is, when I talk to kind of youngsters who are my niece's age, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, they're quite frightened about the state of the world at the moment. Italy electing an overtly fascist government, Orban in Hungary saying he wants to get rid of all the sanctions on Russia, the situation in Russia itself, China's rise, climate change, so many different issues around, and there's quite a lot of fear. What keeps you awake politically at night?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, not a lot, if I'm honest, because I'm actually always a glass half full person. I think it'll all come right in the end. But then I look at Putin and think, not so sure. And it was interesting, the week that Putin invaded Ukraine, we did a phone-in on war anxiety, because people were phoning in saying that they were literally being kept awake, worried about a nuclear war being dropped on this country. Which you can understand, because if Putin was to drop a nuclear bomb anywhere, it's likely to be on this country. I hate to say that, but that is the blunt truth of it. And then I had one of those same callers phone me up last week, was it the week before, and say, I haven't got that anxiety anymore. I'm looking at it logically, and I know it won't happen. So I don't know whether that's just an anecdote from one person, but I think there is more. I think young people are more worried about the future now than they certainly were when we were their age. I mean, we had the Cold War to contend with, the nuclear threat, and all those films in the 1980s, The Day After Tomorrow, I think was one, wasn't it? But I never thought it would happen. I remember doing speeches when I was in my late teens, early 20s for Peace Through NATO against CND. And I think about the nature of those debates and the fact that I would be debating with Joe Rudder, who was like the head of CND. And it was all very good-natured. I tried to understand where she was coming from. I didn't agree with it, but I tried to understand it. And I recognised that she had a legitimate viewpoint, as she did with me. The trouble nowadays is that people don't even understand that somebody else is entitled to have a different viewpoint and express it. And our public debate has got to a point where if you say anything that is against the conventional wisdom, you are seen as a heretic. And I had Charles Moore on my programme the other day, daring to say the NHS could do better. And so, of course, LBC clipped this bit and put it out on Twitter. My Twitter feed gets unreadable for 2 days. They don't actually take on the argument about the NHS, they just say he's a twat. Now, you may think he is a twat, but...
Well, he was wrong on Owen Paterson.
He was wrong on Owen Paterson, you're absolutely right. That doesn't mean to say he's wrong on everything.
No, but he was wrong on Owen Paterson, and he tried to shut down debate about that as well.
But that is where we are now, in our public discourse.
But why is that? Is that because of social media? Is that because of the quality of modern politicians or journalists? Do we have a good press?
Well, I think it's all of those things. I think it is at least in part down to social media, where people have no inhibitions and they say things on social media that they would never say to your face. We have politicians who are, government ministers who are prevented from going out and explaining government policy by Number 10. And I keep saying to Number 10, if you don't put people on my programme, who do you think is going to explain your point of view? Because I'm not. And then you have a press whose sole, or political press, whose sole purpose nowadays seems to just be to try and expose some wrongdoing somewhere, rather than trying to help the democratic process in allowing people to explain things in a reasonably long format. And you just wonder, in the end, where all this is going to end up, because people become so cynical about politicians' motivations. And I can talk till I'm blue in the face about saying, well, 99% of the politicians I know are in it for the right reasons, etc., etc. And you can see people's eyes closing over it. And you can say, well, you can say that you hate politicians as a genre. You go and talk to your neighbour about what your local MP has done for them, and they might have a different point of view. Because if you reduce, it's a bit like we all hate the French, but we all like individual French people.
No, we don't. This is the Labour Party. We're not like that.
You know what I mean.
Oh, so you're not sure whether they're friend or foe either?
I absolutely am. You look at, let's go back to the, why do I keep doing that? You look at the immigration argument, just as I said before, reduce it down to the individual, and all of our problems are solved, I think. And you've got to just try and understand where somebody is coming from, and then you can have a reasonable debate.
Now, I think you're meant to ask me some questions. But you've done it before, so
I have done it
before.
We did a very good podcast, didn't we? Right, let's start with this. You said, you joked about why Tony Blair hadn't made you a government minister. Now, I've always looked at you and thought that there is a frontline politician that's trying to get out of Chris Bryant's body. And then he goes and ruins it by saying something stupid.
Isn't that a song?
Probably, yes it is. Do you sometimes regret the fact that on occasions, and on many occasions, I saw a speech that you made, I can't remember, but it was not that long ago in the House of Commons, where you had the House of Commons in the palm of your hand, including the Conservative benches. There's something about Boris Johnson, I think. And I think, well, there aren't many politicians who can do that. And yes, you were a minister under Gordon Brown, but you should have been, I think, at the top. I actually think you should be now. Why aren't you?
Well, to answer a very specific question, why am I not in a shadow minister? Because I haven't been asked. It's not because I'm...
But why do you think you haven't been asked?
Well, I think some people think that that I take risks, and I think that's true, because I think sometimes you have to take risks in politics, and you have to be brave and you have to be courageous. And if there's one thing I would want to be on my tombstone, as it were, it would be he was courageous.
But not in the Sir Humphrey sense of the word.
No, not in that sense. No, well, I mean, but if you look at the, I think I'm probably the longest standing critic of Putin in the House of Commons, and repeatedly, and in fact I said in 2014 very clearly, if we don't do more, I remember having rows with William Hague, and for that matter with Douglas Alexander about this, saying if we don't take the invasion of Crimea more seriously now and have sanctions, he will come for the rest of Ukraine. Yeah. Do not doubt it. And everybody poo-pooed me, and I've not been a big fan of Prince Andrew. I did quite a lot of stuff on that. The phone hacking row way back from 2003. So I've built up quite a lot of enemies, and sometimes my husband says, can we just limit the number of enemies now? There was a point when I was suing the Metropolitan Police. It was all a bit sort of frightening. But
do you think that people regard you as a maverick more than a team player? Because if you are part of a team, you do have to compromise, don't you? Are you not a good compromiser?
No, I think I'm a pragmatist. I believe in. I remember one of the things that really irritated me about Mrs. Thatcher was that she hated compromise because she said it was wishy-washy. And actually, in Spanish, which is a language I speak because I was partly brought up in Spain, the word for compromise means commitment. So I actually think a commitment to compromise is a really important part of being in politics. So no, I would say that I am a good team player, and I've always liked having a team. In the Ronda this year, we ran our whole campaign, which saw we took so the only seat in Britain that has been Labour since 1885 is the Ronda now. There used to be two, and now there's only one, the Ronda. But we never managed to take 24 out of 25 council seats, which we did this year. And that's because I think I am a team player locally.
What would be your dream job if Labour get into government and Keir Starmer says, look, Chris, I want you on the team, what would your dream job be?
Foreign Secretary.
I knew so.
Why bother asking then?
Well, because they might know.
Yes, I mean, As you said, I was in the Foreign Office for about 5 minutes as Minister, and I absolutely adored it because I felt I was able to make. We had some achievements even in that time when we were certain we were going to lose the general election in 2010, but we introduced the ban on cluster munitions. That was my piece of legislation. We did some new treaties with various other countries. I just felt I was able to make a difference.
And if it wasn't Foreign Secretary, because let's face it, that job probably is unlikely. If he came to you and said, I want you in my team, it's not going to be in the cabinet.
Well, you're not much of a team player here, are you? No, but you're a bit of a maverick.
Yeah, well, I'm never going to be a minister.
Oh, yes, that's true.
That went out the window when Penny Mordaunt dropped out, because I was supporting her.
Was she going to make you a minister?
No, but she might have done in the end if I'd been sort of helped her enough. It could have been.
Were you going to go to the Lords?
No, she didn't. No.
You were offered a peerage by Penny Mordaunt.
I was not. Let's not set that high running. But I would have. It's probably the only thing I would have given up my job in LBC for. If she had said no, if she had said, "Oh, you should come and work for me in number 10," right, I would probably have done that because I've never worked in government and always felt that was sort of something missing. But anyway, back to you. If he said, right, I want you on my team, but you're not going to be in the cabinet, would you accept a job?
Yes, of course I would. I want a Labour government. I will do everything I possibly can to bring about a Labour government at the next general election. I think Liz Truss seems to have the same view as me, so that's very helpful. But I do have one but in here, which is that I do believe in Parliament. I passionately believe in the democratic process and a parliament that really genuinely functions as a parliament, which has enough independently minded people in it to make sure that government is sometimes given a hard time if their policy isn't good enough or their legislation isn't good enough. And I love I work a lot with David Davis and lots of others. I think there's a group of us with Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell and so on, and Kevin Holland-Rake and others. We will try to improve the economic crime bill that the government's just tabled. I love that because I think, again, I'm more interested in getting something done than in just speechifying.
Mm. You said to be Speaker. How do you think the current Speaker's doing?
I think he's doing well. Lindsay and I are not the best of chums. I think that would be the safest way of putting it.
That's why I asked the question.
Yes, I know. I realise. We meet pretty regularly to discuss some of the issues that through standards and privileges committees that we've had to deal with. I think he's made a lot of right calls. He's in a very difficult situation, I think, these days, because two things have changed in my 21 years. There used to be a kind of sacrosanct law that governments didn't whip on house business, and now they always do on everything. And I think that that's a mistake because it means that Parliament ends up being muted. And the second thing is, whatever you think of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they did not make major announcements before coming to the House.
I think you have a slight false memory syndrome there.
Well, it's daily.
Possibly not to the extent.
It's daily now. And if you look at Kwasi Kwarteng, it seems likely that he did have meetings last week with significant people in the hedge fund world who got a very strong impression of what he was going to do on Friday. Previous chancellors would have had to have resigned by now.
Yeah. No, when I saw that story, I thought that must be a conspiracy theory, but it isn't.
No. And so that's my point in a sense. I think it's got worse. I'm sure there were moments when, Alistair Campbell might have briefed something to the press before it ever arrived in Parliament. I don't deny that, but I think it has got considerably worse. And so the poor old Speaker is left with, what can he do? Just wag his finger yet again at the front bench.